Hello. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. I hope it's the start of a series, perhaps an occasional series, perhaps a little bit more regular, where I'll sit down and have a conversation about history, particularly ancient history, the past and how we understand it, with colleagues, with friends, with those who work on the ancient world, whether some of them will be academics who are formally studying, teaching, researching. There'll be those who write for the more general audience. There'll be those who haven't necessarily gone through an academic process of studying, but who have developed a passion for aspects of the past and often come with not simply a dedication, because it's something they so love doing, but the ability to think of different approaches, different questions to ask, different ways of looking at the evidence, of finding the evidence, that help us to expand our understanding of a period in many ways. And in time, I'll probably see if I can, again, persuade them to come on. I'll talk to some of the novelists who write about the ancient world in particular, and how their approach to research differs, because obviously they're coming looking for different things, different types of information, and then it's a question of not just how they find it, but how they use it. So there are lots of people who cross over between all of these things, who are, might be an academic, might be a popular writer as well, and I'll try and get as many on as I can. Others, people who simply are on YouTube and the like, talking about the ancient world. So again, this is something to build up gradually. But we're early days. This is the first one. I suspect that almost all of these chats will be done online via something like Zoom and that sort of thing. But the first one, fortunately enough, I was able to sit down with an old friend and we just talk shop for a bit. So that leaves us without the restriction of time and this sort of thing, and makes it all. I'd like to keep these informal, as the style of the whole channel. So they're not really interviews as such, but conversations. And the idea is to talk about why we find this subject so fascinating, what intrigues us, what got us interested in the first place, how we got to where we are now. So the pathway we followed, whether it's formal study, whether it's just doing this in your spare time and then making yourself an authority on the subject, as so many people have done. So I'd like to keep it all very relaxed. It's not confrontation at all. I've not, this is the closest I'll ever come to interviewing people as such. I've not done it before. In the main, we're going to be starting with friends that I can twist their arms to come on and do this, and then we'll see how things go. So that's the pattern, and this is the first one of, I've just put in a playlist of chats, because I thought of chats with chums, but that sounds a little bit camp and a little bit unfortunate. So but it's not meant to be anything other than talking about the subject we love so much, and why we love it, why we find it exciting, why we find it interesting, and how we go about doing what we do, the challenges of different types of evidence, different approaches. So I'm particularly glad, for all sorts of other reasons, that the first one will also be an interview with an archaeologist friend. So today we're going to be talking to Ian Haynes. Now, this is Professor Ian Haynes of Newcastle University, Professor of Roman Archaeology, and think of it, Newcastle's there at the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall, and it's hard to think of a better place for studying particularly Roman provincial archaeology than up there in Newcastle. Now, Ian and I have known each other for many, many years. We met at a session for new graduate students at Oxford. We began our doctorates at the same time, and the next interview will be with Philip Matajak, who many of you will know from his extensive collection of books, where he has that knack for finding a subject and presenting it in a way that's readily understandable but tells you an awful lot in a very short time. I met both Ian and Matty on the same day at this same session, and we've been friends ever since. So he'll be on next. But today we've got Ian Haynes, and I was lucky enough to catch Ian while he was in Oxford, and I was up there for giving my Pharos lecture series, which has just come to an end, and we were able to sit down in the same room, put the camera up on a tripod and just chat. Now, I didn't do things perfectly. I've got the positioning wrong. Ian should have been in the chair where I'm sitting so we could focus more on him. But I'm new to all this. We were making it up as we were going along, and we were having a bit of a laugh, as friends tend to, as well as we were going along. So Ian and I were the only two people really working on the Roman army when I began my doctorate and he began his. My doctorate became the Roman army at war, his by a process of a rather more long evolution that allowed it to become, I think, a far deeper work of scholarship, is published as the Blood of the Provinces, and I would heartily recommend. It's about the auxilia and what the experience of serving in the Roman army might have meant for all these people drawn from various parts of the empire who are not in the main Roman citizens until they've completed their service. Aspects of religion, culture, the army lifestyle, living in a barracks, living in a fort, all this sort of thing, and the implication this has. The book, because there's a limit of word count with a doctoral thesis, in those days it was 100,000 words, I think it still is at Oxford, I'm not sure about elsewhere, you had to be very careful, and there were lots of things you had to leave out. That's why there's nothing about sieges in my Roman army at war, because there simply wasn't space for it. Ian, I think his book grew a lot and gained a lot because it built on research he did subsequently, as well as those 3 years of doing the doctorate. So there's an awful lot in there, and it's fascinating for asking different sorts of questions. And one of the great things, apart from the fact that we were interested in similar things and we got on so well and are still great friends, is that Ian is a proper archaeologist. And Ian he'd been undergraduate at Newcastle University, he'd been on digs, he'd worked for the Museum of London, he'd done all sorts of things like that. I was trained as an ancient historian, very much texts, inscriptions to some extent, and while I had very good tutors who made sure that you tried to look at all the different sources of information, the archaeology as well as the ancient history, nevertheless you tend to be more familiar with the stuff you know and the stuff you're used to. So we came with different approaches and different ways of doing things that were wonderfully complementary, because we could chat back and forth with the other one, bounce ideas around, and the other one would point out, well, have you considered this? Have you looked at this? This is a way of doing it. Now, if you're studying the Roman army, so much of the evidence is archaeological that it is really vital. And I would say about most aspects of the ancient world, if you try to study just history and seem to think archaeology is something separate, then you're only ever going to see a part of the story, part of the picture, and it will be very much to your loss. So there is a lot out there. So Ian has followed a career as a proper archaeologist, professional archaeologist. He's worked extensively in different parts of the Roman Empire. I've been with him on some recce's we did in Romania and Bulgaria. And I basically carried equipment and walked up and down a field with a resistivity meter and brought good Welsh weather with me, because the Goldsworthy climate effect means that wherever we go it tends to rain a lot, or wherever I go anyway. And Ian ended up not working on those particular sites, but working on others in the area and more broadly. More recently than that, I'm hoping to get him back to talk in detail about some of the projects he's worked on in more recent years. One of the big ones has been Rome Transformed, which is just coming to a conclusion now, and he's in the arduous process of writing it up, or collating all the reports, where he assembled a very broad and really high quality team of people who brought different approaches, different methodology, different technology to looking at I think it's the eastern part really of the Caelian Hill in Rome. If you go to Rome today, walk past the Colosseum, go up the slope towards the Lateran Church, the original big cathedral church of Rome, underneath which are the remains of the fort and barracks of the Equites Singulares, or at least part of the unit, the Emperor's Horse Guards. Beneath that there's private housing from earlier periods. There's an awful lot, and they've been doing work in what remains underground that you can reach with considerable care, and trying to join it up together. They've looked more broadly around the area, both within the Aurelian Wall around the city, but also outside. They found lots of very, very exciting stuff, and it's to Ian's credit that he would be the first to say that, well, so many people have taken part in this, but he's brought them together, got the funding, got the organisation, and helped to manage this very, very big project that is telling us a lot of new stuff and raising lots of questions, as well as giving us answers and information and data. So as I say, hopefully we'll get him to talk about that. Hopefully another time we'll get him on as well, because again, in recent years, he and Tony Wilmot have been working at Bird Oswald Fort on Hadrian's Wall, or actually they've been working outside the fort itself at the Vicus, the area, the civilian settlement outside the fort. Now, Tony Wilmot's, has got the wall in his blood, and I think Bird Oswald Fort in his blood as well. He's worked there on... You have to wonder, if you added up his stipendia, his different excavations, whether he would have served there for longer than many of the soldiers in garrison. So again, this is these are people who really know their stuff, and that again, I remember there's something I'd put in my short book on Hadrian's Wall about Sir Ian Richmond had identified a tower outside what would become Bird Oswald Fort. Now they've discovered it's not a tower at all, it's part of a bathhouse, and a very substantial one from later, so it doesn't predate Hadrian's Wall, it's something later. So the swines have already proved me wrong on that one thing, but that's the nature of academic study, but particularly archaeology, in that you are adding to the data, you're adding to the information all the time, so that interpretations will change, because something you thought was one thing proves to be something completely different when you actually get to look there properly. And it's interesting. We'll talk a little bit about this in the discussion of all the changes, the new technology that's come in the course of just Ian's career. How things have changed, you can gather from geophysics and things lots of tantalizing glimpses of what might be there. But often, until you actually go and dig thoroughly, then you can't necessarily confirm what it actually is and explain all of it. You're guessing. But of course, the trend within archaeology in recent decades has been to do smaller areas in far greater detail and discovering far more information from that. Doing it in a way that means that it takes longer and is even more expensive. And it's a little bit we'll touch on as well in the discussion, because again, I don't think people always realise what's involved, what underlies archaeological excavation. All the organisation, all the fundraising, all the bringing together of the different specialists, then the recording of everything. All of that has to be done. Archaeologists have to be practical people, as well as scientists, as well as scholars, as well as people working within the humanities. They bring together all of this because there's an awful lot of sheer organisation and practical aspects to be done that might be done in fairly extreme weather as well. And hopefully, again, in videos to come, we'll get to talk to people from other parts of the world as well, where, if you're working in northern Britain, it's usually rain and mud and wind that are the big problems you have to deal with to keep morale going. Some areas nearer in hotter climates, you might be dealing with extreme heat during the day and the slog of working in those conditions. And again, archaeologists have to deal with this. They have to make things work, whereas those of us who tend to spend most of our time in libraries, or when we visit a site, it's all nicely presented and already conserved for us, or we're just visiting and being shown around by the people who are actually doing the work there. We have the sort of the lighter end of things. It's so anyway, I'm glad that this first talk is with an archaeologist, and as I say, a real one, somebody who is highly respected in the field, has done terrific work, and again, you can tell by the quality of the people who work with him how much, how good Ian is at getting things organised, making things happen. And like a lot of the bright people around there, he has far more ideas than will probably ever be put into practice in one lifetime. But nevertheless, it's just a sign of, you're always waiting to hear what the next project will be and the next one and this sort of thing. So, as I say, this is Ian Haynes, and I'll put some links in the description to the video to his page at Newcastle University, but also that has links to a lot of the online projects with which he's been involved, particularly those about the Roman frontiers and about Hadrian's Wall. There's a moderated online course that's highly recommended if you have an interest in this. So I'll put all of that down in the description section to the video. But anyway, that's, as usual, you can see my normal long-winded rambling way of introducing things. But as I say, this is the first of what I hope will be a series of conversations about studying the past, and I'm absolutely thrilled that I've managed to twist Ian's arm and get him to do the first one. So without further ado, let's move on to the interview, and we'll have a chat with Professor Ian Haynes at Newcastle University. So Ian, thanks very much for sitting down to talk to us, and we've known each other for, well, a long time, haven't we?
Yes, it will be about 30 years.
About 30 years, exactly,
years,
yes,
yeah.
when we were about the only two people studying the Roman army for our doctorates at Oxford.
So far as we knew, there might have been hundreds of others we never met.
Exactly, but they didn't count because they didn't come out in daylight. So,
sorry, colleagues.
So one of the themes I'd like to discuss in these talks really is, how do you get interested? I've done other stuff about how I got interested in the ancient world and sort of Asterix books and epics on the television, this sort of thing. But in your case, what sparked the interest? Why archaeology, the ancient world, why the Romans?
So it's, I can remember, I think, the moment of the spark. I was at school, at primary school, and it was raining. And when it rained, they would lock us all inside. I'm sure they wouldn't do that nowadays, health and safety and all that.
No, they lock us outside.
And we had this stack of ancient comics and things lying around that we were to sort of be distracted by. And I remember opening a spread in one of these, and there was just this picture of a large number of people running around brandishing swords and wearing sandals. And it was an enthusiastic visualization of a moment in the Roman Civil War. And something about that image caught my imagination. And very soon after, we were doing a school project on the Romans. And I was just determined to do as much on the Romans as I could. So the poor teachers ended up having reams of unnecessary work. One of my poor colleagues, now a very eminent politician, I am embarrassed to say, found his work sabotaged by me because I couldn't bear the idea that he might write more than I did. And so,
it's very Roman.
Yes, it's very Roman. It is not good academic practice.
Yes. This is not. Don't try this at home, kids.
Don't try this at home. No, but it's definitely something I left behind at primary school, and would not recommend to anybody. And I became fascinated. So I became fascinated by the Romans first. Then I became fascinated by archaeology. And then I just became because archaeology was for me the particular way that I would connect with past lives. And from there, archaeology is just a huge key to all aspects of the human story, right the way through to the present day. We are living in a material world, after all, as Madonna would assure us, and that has archaeological implications, but also as a way of reaching back to the very earliest humans as well. So, although I am a Romanist, I am also someone who finds the study of the past fascinating in all its facets, and that's been helpful because when I have been privileged, amongst other things, to be a chair of an archaeology team at university, or school if you prefer that term, or department if you prefer that term. I've got why my colleagues were excited about whatever it was they were doing. It excited me too. I just, on balance, knew a little bit more about the Romans. I was less ignorant about the Romans than I was about other societies, but still have a long way to go.
Well, we're all learning, aren't we? I mean, that's the striking thing. You look back at what you did and said 10 years, 20 years ago, and you thought you knew everything then. And even though it's easier with the ancient world in that there's less information, there's still a lot of it and the different ways of thinking about it. It always struck me as odd that you can go to a talk about a completely different topic and something goes click and you think, oh, hang on a minute, I could try that. And it's not always directly related. It just seems to help you think. You get stimulated by other people's ideas. So I think the more you read, listen to other stuff, the better you seem to do.
I think so. I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily give you a pathway to understand that which happened, but it opens your thinking to the array of possibilities. And I think that other point that you know that yes, it's emphatically the case that we're all learning, and I think that that draws me in two directions really. One is that one of the unwritten books that await me, and there are many that I won't get round to writing, but one I feel I really ought to do is the Book of Mistakes, where I own up to all sorts of errors. And I think the other one is that it is an enormous privilege in life to be in a situation where you are obliged, pushed, sometimes in my case kicking and screaming, to keep learning.
Yeah.
And someone said to me the other day, you only really start aging when you stop learning. And I thought that's an interesting one. I'll use that to keep the years at bay.
Yes, I'm not sure the years will listen, but at least we'll go down defiantly, all guns blazing on that one.
Yeah.
So we've got the young Ian Haynes, kept in by rain in school, suddenly seeing the Romans and things. So how did you move on from there? How did you get from being enthused primary school kid to...
So the Romans in this scene were fighting.
Yeah.
And I thought, my goodness, I don't know, what did I think? Daring do, blood and guts, none of the things that really I would particularly wish to embrace in later life.
But schoolboy's mentality is different.
But I'm always very interested in the spark, because whatever it is, however apparently unedifying, however much one might laugh about it in later years, it still gives you an energy and an interest to unlock things. And so what happened then, I think, was I became quite interested at that stage in the Roman army. And from there I thought, well, how do I learn about this? And quite early on, interestingly enough, one of the things that particularly fascinated me is how do soldiers work in society? How do they form parts of society? Now that, for those who are interested in campaigns and tactics, that's very important, but it's also interesting when you're looking at a society such as the Roman Empire, where that has multiple different social dimensions. And so my next step, I think, was to try and better understand what this thing was. That took me on a journey through very elementary epigraphy, where better adjusted children were having birthday parties. I was able to persuade my father to take me to museums, particularly the Great North Museum in Newcastle, a wonderful place, then the Museum of Antiquities, and to basically copy down inscriptions. And so that led to a certain interest in the material, then the opportunity to visit places associated, but all the time this is continuing to widen, I guess, is an important facet. Yeah.
I think you want to know more about these people, don't you? It's the people in their world and their attitudes, and whether they're soldiers, being soldiers, or just living the rest of their lives, how they interact with everybody, what it was like.
I think that's right. I mean, there is, of course, a big debate within history and now also within visualization about, the dangers of imagining one can get beyond a certain point. But nonetheless, there is a real drive to have that deeper appreciation of the experience of people in the past. Not only to better understand the past, but because it gives you a broader array of insights with which to look at the future as well.
And I mean, the theme of your doctoral thesis, when I was looking at the Roman army going off and fighting people, you were looking rather more sensibly at the cultural mixture. And that's a simplistic way of putting it, but you look particularly at the auxilia, so the non-citizen soldiers, or at least in the main they begin as non-citizens, that they'll end up with it, and how they fitted in. And this is, for those who are interested, the book The Blood of the Provinces, which developed from that, but I think is very much in itself a story of how the ideas you had first developed as you learn more, as you thought more, as you expanded to make them much broader in many ways, more detailed in others, but a different perspective.
That's right. I mean, I think we pacify the past at our peril. So certain issues in the cultural exchange always have a taint or more of violence about them. But I think one of the points that people with experience in the military will straight away recognise is that soldiers do not in fact spend more than a small proportion of their time, if any, fighting. A point that is perhaps less widely recognised, but still, I think, to be observed in many contexts, is that conquest, control, dominance are not just battlefield notions, they are actually often one in essentially cultural exchange as well. So the way in which people are coming into Rome's orbit through military service is also part of not just a military experience, it's a cultural experience through a military prism. And the soldiers here of the auxilia are, to a certain extent, I think, the invisible being made visible. We know relatively little about the lives of the massive provincial populations, but as soon as they actually enter Roman service, there's a lot more documentation about them, and frankly, when we excavate some of these sites, there's just a lot more stuff to work with. So that side of it appealed to me in a way that cultural exchange in militaries through time has been a strong strand of my interest. Yeah.
And it's obviously particularly there with the Romans because it's always at least half the army, whatever period you look at, but particularly from the archaeological point of view, and in many respects epigraphy as well, it's that first century through to 3rd century or early 3rd where we have so much more information of this type in a way we simply don't get for the later army, which just is a bit more shadowy. And the earlier army is different because it's the Roman people going off doing stuff, and the foreign soldiers that they have then leave much less trace. They haven't become. But one of the things I always liked from the beginning of that was the way you approached it, not in the old-fashioned, well, this is people becoming Roman, but it's how are they changing, and how are they changing the Romans and the state and the empire with which they interact. So it's ongoing.
Yes.
So that was early work. That was the thesis and this sort of thing. How did you find? You've just been with Tony Wilmot excavating at Bird Oswald in the last few years. So you've been looking at a Roman army site. You've done lots of other things as well. How did you branch out? How did it develop, and why particularly did you choose places? Because you've worked in Romania, you've worked in Italy, you've worked in Britain, and probably more I've forgotten just in that or something.
I've been lucky to work in a fair few different parts of the world now. So I think there are various themes that just interest me profoundly, but there are also moments of opportunity. And in archaeology, I think those can come up in ways that are endlessly fascinating and often surprising. So the work in Romania, for example, started when I was exploring another theme that I find very interesting, which is the issue of religious transformation in the Roman world, and was invited by German and Romanian colleagues to co-direct a project out there. Now, that took me to excavating the sanctuary of Liber Pater, and from there, I should mention that's in Alba Iulia, yes, and Liber Pater, generally better known as Bacchus Dionysus in the wider world. That then led me to a deeper interest in a really fascinating Roman province, a late arrival and early departure from the Roman Empire, Dacia, incredibly rich evidence, wonderful place to work. That then took me to other parts of Romania, and actually then the Black Sea.
At this point I'll slip in some pictures of us, the two of us at the Adam Plessy Museum.
That's right, yes.
What, about 97 or something
Must
like that?
have been about
long time ago,
Yes, it would have been 97, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And so from there then, yes, the Black Sea, so I then worked on sites on the Danube. I worked very, very briefly in Bulgaria.
Oh, that's right.
And so that was a strand. And of course, at all of these sites, you are looking at so many different populations coming together, so many points of contact, and so many different ways in which that contact is evidenced. And I think one of the points is, I mean, my job description, as it were, is that I am an archaeologist. I'm a professor of archaeology. But I would always hold to the view that one is essentially seeking to address questions about the past, and therefore one seeks that evidence wherever one can. And obviously there are rich textual sources, sometimes directly for the place they've worked on, often that illuminate it, even if indirectly. So the journey then spread from there. The involvement in Italy in the first instance did have a military facet. That is to say that one of my graduate students at the time was interested in the archaeology of the guilds or collegia in the Roman army, and was received very generously by a fine colleague who I've since worked with for a couple of decades now in Rome, shown around this extraordinary complex underneath the St. John Lateran Basilica, the world's first cathedral. And that led to a project to characterise this incredible array of labyrinthine exposed archaeological structures well underneath the ground, up to about 8.5 metres in depth. And from there, I've then expanded that work with fantastic teams, fantastic colleagues, and again with Paolo Liverani, whose active generosity sparked so much of this, across 68 hectares of southeast Rome, looking at all sorts of structures from the 1st to 8th century, many of them with no military association.
Just as an aside, and this is throwing something I didn't talk with you about before, looking at the fort there, the fort of the Singularis Augusti, aspects of it, particularly in some of the reconstructions we've got. Now, hopefully sometime, if you're willing, you'll come back and we can do an interview and talk more specifically about the Rome project, because it's such a huge thing. What's the link, or what's the sense of working somewhere like Bird Oswald, a fort on Hadrian's Wall, to a fort in Rome? How much is the familiar, this is the Roman army doing its stuff? Some of the reconstructions that I've seen, the rather nice term used, provocation, which is emphasising the fact that yes, we're trying to put this together, but we haven't got all the pieces to reconstruct something precisely. We're trying to give a view of the world, how this might have been, which is really all we can hope to do, but it's a way of helping us to think about it.
Yes, it's very much
not set in stone.
Yes, I think that's right, because we can't go back and say it absolutely looked like this, but we can get sometimes extremely close to some elements, and others there's a bit of kite flying involved. I think one of the biggest problems I find with that approach, which is really so important to think with, is this issue of how one manages an attempted breadth of vision.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, if you've any involvement, say, if we take the two examples you gave, Bird Oswald on Hadrian's Wall, the Castronova in Rome, occupied at the same time, occupied by a military formation that's approximately a similar size, both occupied by forces that are recruited originally from the provinces. It is that balance between how do we employ, if at all, analogy. Analogy is very important in a lot of archaeological thinking and interpretation. It's both a great asset and an Achilles heel at some level. And how do we know when not to? Yeah. So the best principle forward is always to say, right, well, what have I actually got in front of me? Yeah. But you have to really fight quite determinedly to unthink certain things. Yeah. And at one level, one of the big differences with the Castronova is you are in a world where people are producing very impressive brick structures for often largely civil purposes on an epic scale. Yeah. Therefore, a whole raft of the skills that are used for those can be used for something of a military plan. Then another challenge you've got is you're in Rome. Yeah. So
there's a million people or so there just on your doorstep.
So that influences how you sit within the landscape, what your tactical obligations and requirements are, how you are resourced, and the message that you seek to convey. Message to convey through architecture. So it's both thinking about it, but being quite explicit about what you need to, if you like, unthink as well. Yeah. And that's why provocation is important, because the idea is that it provides essentially arguments that make the rationale for your visualizations transparent to others, so they can see what's evidence-based and what is based on other forms of knowledge and what is based in ill-informed hypothesis.
So stepping back a bit, let's think about I think first of all, let's ask, what do you think are some of the most important things you've learned along the way? And related to that, how much has archaeology changed in the way it's done? Because there's obviously a lot of technological aspect, but also in other respects, since you were a young undergraduate holding a trowel for the first time.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to take that question as a question about method, which
Right.
may not quite be the way you meant it, but you're linking
want to know
the
what
two
you think,
points.
not what I think.
Yeah. So I think I know that I know less about the empire than I might have thought I did before. I think one is daily confronted with one's ignorance, which is a good thing, and yet one tries to climb the mountain and see further. As far as method is concerned, yes, it's almost impossible to keep up. In fact, it is impossible to keep up with the spectrum of innovation in archaeological method. And archaeologists tend to be, as far as budget allows, early adopters.
Yeah.
Archaeologists tend to be inherently drawn towards interdisciplinary work. You know, one moment you might be talking to an expert in parasitology, the next you might be talking to a specialist in geospatial engineering, and on it goes.
Sorry, just to interrupt, there's a practical element, just reminds me of something you said years ago, which I will probably now misquote, but that you almost felt every archaeologist needs to know something about building and farming.
Yeah,
so
well,
much
that's
of the
also
evidence
true.
you do. But
That's so true.
there
Yeah.
comes back to, there's a very practical element, because virtually everything you're looking at has been made.
Yes.
Or shaped in some way.
Yes.
And there is a technical aspect to that,
That's right.
as well as all the cultural assumptions of why, how they're doing things, and that's anyway. Sorry, back to the.
No, I mean, I think you make a very good point. I mean, one of the things that I used to insist on, really, when new students at any level or new colleagues at any level arrived in the department, was that we would have a traditional skills day at the beginning of the year, because the vast majority of 21st century people do not raise their own or make their own food or hunt their own food. They don't build their own homes. There are of course many exceptions to both, but in general they don't. And yet they're studying people for whom, for the most part, this is an absolutely essential part of everyday life. And so that's a more general issue in terms of thinking about, you know, what we know and what we don't know. And sometimes it's enough to say, or to help drive home the point, look, this is that which you are just seeing as a wall, that which you're just seeing as a pit. There is much more going on, and it feeds into and illuminates a much bigger picture. So that's one side of it. I think the other thing that's going on with all of this that is so important is that you, if you are fortunate to be what we call principal investigator, or leading a large project with many different specialists, one of the questions is that the way in which you hopefully remain alert to what you need to know, but you need to balance, I think, an attention to detail, or ensuring that detail is attended to, with the capacity to zoom out and see how the overall works are going. So that's very important. Now, an issue that we're dealing with now, in addition to the plethora of different disciplines, you can connect almost any subject to archaeology and history in reality. In addition to that side of things, I think something else that's incredibly important is just how you deal with large quantities of data, and you make the interpretation of the data work, and you ensure that you actually have conversations across disciplines.
Yeah.
So that issue of how do you make interdisciplinarity work as more than a buzzword. Many universities like to talk about it in ways that I often find actually really trivial and disappointing. How do you make that really lively and engaging and taking everyone's game forward? Because it's getting harder and harder. We're able to produce more and more data now on a scale and at a speed that was inconceivable 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And 5 years ago was inconceivable 5 years before that, and so on. And in fact, everything is just accelerating.
Yeah. So but there's an element where there's still the impression, there's the element where you bring the experience of the observer to looking at the thing as well.
I think so.
That means even with all that information, you can't skip that stage. They're not simply quantities or data points that are simple to understand, because in the end, you're trying to reconstruct this complex world.
Yes, if not quite reconstruct it, because that's a double-edged word. Some ways.
Understand.
People understand it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they don't. Yes.
And I think one of the points is how can you be a good generalist? Mm-hmm. How can you really bring together and get the most out of teams where not only is the expertise different, the language different, the professional incentive different, but how do you help to bring that together to a bigger team? So I think I've experienced enough examples of me doing that badly to feel that I've learned quite a lot in the process.
Well, we all learn from the things we try not to do again, and unless you try it, you never quite
Absolutely.
know. And I mean, that's true in the specific sense of whether it's the small finds people or the pottery specialist or the metal specialist or the leather specialist, depending on the site of what it might be, and also the more general, the context of it, let alone anything specific. In terms of technology for finding information, how far is the element of radar, anything like that? Does that make life easier but also harder? Because in the end, you get data, you get something which seems to show patterns, but how often can you say confidently until you've gone and looked that that's what's there?
Yeah, so I mean that's something that comes up in an aspect of archaeological geophysics quite extensively, and it is a very good example at the moment, and I think will continue to be for the foreseeable future, where data capture is one thing, the interpretation of those increasingly large bodies of data is another, because it involves an understanding of the specific local circumstances, it involves an understanding of the particular sort of aspects of settlement at different moments through time. But it also involves a series of unknowns, because if you're doing non-intrusive work, by definition, you may have a very partial understanding of which parts of the past are actually surviving and which have long since been robbed away. So colleagues are, and rightly, looking towards various forms of AI to help along the road. But while AI will undoubtedly have a whole series of important implications for the many disciplines with which archaeology interacts, it will still also undoubtedly run into problems in terms of attempted applications, because there are an array of things that it just can't actually train for.
I've done some question and answer sessions, and one of them was about how useful do you think AI is going to be for your work, and in my particular case I can't see it at all, because there is the experience you bring to something, and it's hard to see how you convey that, because it is inevitably subjective, but it's impressionistic, so that may not be perfect. That's the best a human being is going to be able to do, and a machine is not going to be able to do anything better than that, or even replicate that because it is in my case it'll be the texts I've seen elsewhere, but it's sites you've seen elsewhere, artifacts, objects, the experience you get that's always amazed me with some of the small finds people, of how they can take what seems to me to be a tiny piece of pottery and recognise and date it remarkably quickly, or just because they've looked at so much of this stuff.
Yes, and I think sometimes if people are too fast on some of this,
and I'm sure I've leapt to conclusions that.
But I think there's always this. I guess it's a classic sort of thing that one might see on the telly. Someone picks something up and instantly it's a blah 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 blah.
Oh
blah.
yes, yeah.
And in reality, that does happen. It really does happen from time to time, but it often just doesn't. And there's a lot of blood, sweat and tears into doing an identification. I think even that little example that you gave there with a sort of a sherd, what do you learn from a sherd, is extraordinary. What we learn now and what we learned from a sherd 20 years ago are they're orders of magnitude more that we can do with it.
Yeah.
So the question also...
And we're still probably struggling in a lot of cases to understand what it actually means.
In some
When
cases,
you get
I think so.
same as some of the analysis of bone or teeth, or this thing that has traces and suggests
Yeah.
origins for the data set's building, but it's not there where you can say confidently.
So sometimes you will get these marvellous, almost semi-detached pieces of work where someone will say, "Well, this is brilliant because it, it shows this, that, or the other,"
Yeah.
and then you'll say, "I get that that's brilliant. I get that that's interesting, but I think it's more interesting to you than it is to the wide array of questions that the rest of us try to answer." You know. And that doesn't denigrate that.
No.
But it does. In fact, it creates an interesting dynamic, because if you're a team leader, you're looking both at team needs, task needs, and individual needs.
Yeah.
So sorry, that's three things, not both. And it's and the individual need of that specialist might be to pursue that particular.
Yeah, and
rabbit
the thing
hole.
is, each person will come up with questions that you might not have done.
Absolutely.
So that it all feeds in and together in the same way that you might have a suggestion for them that's going to help in the same way.
Absolutely.
So it's all that team effort. Now we've been going a while, so I think, as I say, hopefully we will get you back and we can talk more specifically about things. I thought just let's have a few reminiscences, a few moments from, because it compared to a lot of other academic disciplines, archaeologists go out in the wind and the cold or the hot sun, and they have to do practical things, because you cannot just dig a hole and see pull it out and see what happens. This is you have to be scientific in your method. You also have to be very safe, and those concerns have grown. You look at photographs of excavations in the sort of 1930s, let alone in the 19th century, and you think, good grief, what are these people risking? And mostly they got away with it, but nevertheless you couldn't do it. But also, what are they missing? All the things that, again, because of methods, because of analysis, they couldn't record, or they didn't know how to, that you can get. So there is far more. You can mess things up and blur and confuse the data set that you're collecting by doing it wrongly. So, just from that practical point of view, are there moments that stand out of either exciting things where you've seen something on a site, or something's been uncovered that you thought, oh wow, that's really interesting, that's changed what we're doing, or those days where you've had to work to try and persuade people that yes, this is worthwhile, you may be cold, you may be wet, you may want to go home, but there's all that leadership, that personal, there's a social aspect almost about archaeology, because it isn't something that on the whole you do as an individual. The work is a group thing.
Yes. I think that point about archaeology being often a team sport. I mean, we do definitely have our moments as individual scholars, but I think that is an important part of it. It's very significant. How you build the team, how the team performs, when things are boring. You are not always finding cool stuff. Being able to cope with periods of boredom is actually an essential part of any real research, I would say. Anyone who thinks it's one long adrenaline ride is not a researcher.
Yes, the montage of some film or something where the dramatic music plays and the lawyer solves his case, or the Indiana Jones tracks down and solves the puzzle.
So it's the hard plug is really important. And when that is in driving rain, when that is in baking sun, when that is perhaps in some nasty, rather dodgy, cramped place underground, or if, like me, you have qualms about working at heights when you're many metres up, and getting a touch of the old vertigo, keeping teams focused is one really important thing. So sometimes it's as simple as making sure the rotations are right. Often, individual needs matter. If you're dealing with very inexperienced workers, many of them, or ex-archaeologists at an early stage of their career, you need to be thinking about their physical welfare, as you mentioned, which can cover everything from dehydration to just bad tool working practice. But I think the other thing is that there needs to be a deep sense in the minds of everyone who is involved, at least in excavation activity, that excavation is destruction. Archaeologists are almost Shiva-like figures, I would say. They are creators and destroyers at the same time. And so you are having that moment to better understand our shared history, but the process of better understanding it through excavation is emphatically destroying its physical elements. It's not just about recovering the artifacts, the whole thing is captured in this matrix of information. And once the trowel has scraped through it, once the mattock's gone through, those relationships have been sundered. You better record them properly. So emphasising the importance of the task is one thing. And the other thing I would say is don't forget the joy. For many people, experience of archaeological fieldwork is something they never want to repeat. But for many people, it is actually something that has a disproportionately big impact on their view of how they operate with others, how they deal with practical situations, how their spirit of investigation and interrogation develops. And to those, I also like to say, don't forget to remember the joy. There are moments of joy, and there are emphatically moments of extraordinary privilege, not only as someone who gets a special encounter with our shared past, but also the privileged access. I've worked in some astonishing places, and that many a tourist visitor would love to have seen but wouldn't get access to. So don't forget, as in other things in life, to savour the joy when it comes.
So is there if you went to speak to the Ian in primary school who was in because of the wet thing, is there still some of that excitement about, not about the same thing, not about the picture of men fighting each other with swords, but the sense of trying to understand, trying to get a clearer picture, some sense of,
without deluding ourselves that we can ever relive the past. We can have encounters with it which can sometimes be breathtakingly immediate. And we can most emphatically reflect on it in ways that are genuinely illuminating of our current and future circumstances. How we do that can be debated, contested, and is not everywhere apparent, but we can.
So it's still stimulating and it's still often fun, even though it's hard slog as well.
Yes, I confess the word fun is an interesting one. I tend to recall Mortimer Wheeler's line about archaeology as being less a profession and more of a vendetta. And so my view, as soon as I am fortunate enough to launch a major new project, is this is just going to be really tough, and it is an attritional process, and it will be a success if I come out, obviously with all members of the team happy and intact, and if I've done the right thing by the trust that's been placed in me. And at the end of a project, if I've managed to do that, there is normally a period of maybe a couple of hours where I think, this huge lift has been, the weight has been taken, that was good, I enjoy that, and then I look on to the next project almost instinctively, and then the whole graph starts again.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that with books. You're desperate to finish one, and you just think, oh, I need this out of the way, but very quickly you want to do another. It's just, it's something addictive almost.
Yes.
There's an excitement to it, but it is as you say, it's a privilege to be able to do it.
Yeah.
But it's also, it remains so fascinating. That sense, I don't know if you have the same, of actually, after decades of study, I'm not sure if I know less than I thought and I believed I knew in the first place, but the questions just get more and more fascinating as you go on.
I think that's right, they do, and I think the past also serves, I hope, to keep us humble. That's one of the messages we should take at multiple levels, both about the levels of our ignorance, and about the good fortune we have, most of us have, to live in a world with 21st century medical care and extended life expectancy.
Well, thanks very much for talking to us, Ian, and as I say, hope to get you back again. The next time it might be Zoom, unless I can track you down in your lair at another point. But anyway, thanks so much, it's been fascinating.
Thank you very much, Adrian.